How would you define an indie game? One person might say that it's any game made by a small group of people, whereas another will say that it's any game that's not made by a AAA company. The definition can be a bit vague and broad, especially because there aren't any specific numbers attached to terms like small, so the line between what is an indie game and what isn't is often a little blurry. At their core, indie games generally offer some really interesting and unique experiences that AAA or even AA devs can't usually bring to us, to the point where many people will actually forgo AAAs altogether and basically just play indie games. This isn't because AAA dev teams can't come up with unique ideas, but more so because everything has to fit in with the AAA business structure to make as much money as possible. Basically, some guys in suits don't have the balls to make games about topics that are even remotely niche. Queue up the next installment of whatever genre is currently trending, right guys? And because of these original ideas, and often emotionally hitting themes, many indies can get a lot of the same mainstream recognition as those bigger games, and in many cases can become more culturally significant than them too. So what are the factors that split indies apart from AA or AAA games? What defines an indie game? Two of the biggest factors that can define an indie game are the size of the development team and the overall budget for the game. Typically, an indie dev team will be made up of either a singular person or a small group of people. But there's that word again, small. Wherever you look, you're going to find a different answer, but most of the answers I found ranged between 1 and 30 people, which sounds about right. That isn't to say that a game made by, say, 35 people suddenly can't be considered an indie, but when you get into the hundreds, I don't know man, sounds like you're pushing it a bit. Taking a look at Celeste, one of my favourite indies to exist, a lot of what was made here was only really possible because of the extremely small development team, who generally would each be working on completely separate parts of the game. This is the reason that the story could talk about such deep topics. There weren't any people in suits hovering over their shoulders telling them what they are and aren't allowed to include in the game. They could all just create something great. Now, if the team sizes sound pretty vague, I have some bad news for you, because the budgets can be even more vague than that. An indie game can honestly have a budget of, well, however much your PC costs, plus development time. Typically, an indie game will be funded primarily out of pocket or through crowdfunding campaigns. That being said though, the actual budget can span up to millions of dollars, but a more reasonable amount for a lot of indies is probably under the 100,000 mark. Undertale is maybe one of the most prominent indies of the past decade, and it was funded basically entirely through crowdfunding, where people could pledge money for different rewards. One thing that many people don't take into account when it comes to the game's budget is that the marketing is a part of it too. A big AAA studio will be able to get some great and expensive marketing campaigns for their game, which will get seen by millions and millions of people, whereas an indie game won't generally have that luxury. Typically, an indie will rely on websites like YouTube and Twitter to post updates and gameplay trailers for their games. And this works fine, don't get me wrong, but it's such a contrast to something like TV ads, or plastering Luigi's face onto a fucking bus. I mean, I'm not complaining about it. The main thing that definitely does help to define if a game is independent though, is that they don't have the financial support from a larger company. Clues in the name really. They aren't dependent on a bigger company's money to make their game. Stardew Valley was created entirely by a single person, Eric Barone, and the project was also entirely funded through his job at a theatre. However, the game was published by a company called Chucklefish, who themselves are an independent publisher. Now, if Chucklefish were a huge company that was throwing money towards Stardew to help in its development, then that would probably be a bit of a different story. But they weren't, and I don't think anybody is trying to argue that Stardew isn't an indie game. This is where it can sometimes get a little bit annoying, because when trying to define indie games, your definition can often have lots of false negatives and false positives. Which is why we do sort of need to look at the context behind most indies to help understand them a little bit. Some games will get published by another company, but that company will also be pretty small too, and won't give financial aid, but may help out with certain aspects of the game, like ports or websites. One drawback to financial independence though, is that you also carry the risk that comes along with it. A lot of indie games will go through the entire development process and release to just have barely anybody play them, and this means that all of the money that went into the game isn't coming back. Now this isn't the biggest issue if the game was crowdfunded, firstly because the people that pledged are also probably going to be actually playing the game, but also because that money was given for the sole purpose of making the game, rather than it being out of the pocket from the developer. But it does mean that everybody involved in the game probably isn't going to get a massive amount of recognition for their work, and that can potentially set their career back a bit. Now, if the game was paid for out of pocket, it can be pretty devastating for the game to flop, which, sadly, is the case for a lot of indies. Again, marketing is expensive, and doing it yourself can be pretty tough. And when you think about just how many indie devs are trying to get you to look at their game, the competition can be fairly brutal. A AAA company can generally afford to run these sorts of risks without the entire company going bankrupt. Sure, it could lead to layoffs, which is awful, of course. But let's be honest, a huge company CEO isn't going to lose sleep over it. They'd have to have a soul for that. One thing that indie games are known for is that they tend to be innovative and creative whenever they can. This is something that, again, isn't really possible for most AAA titles, because they often have way too many people dictating what can or cannot be included in the game. And when this isn't the case, it's the only thing people will talk about for a week straight, because, oh my god, they finally let the developers do what they want. One thing I personally love when it comes to these freedoms are in the characters' dialogue. More often than not, the dialogue in indies tends to feel a lot more natural, and it gives the characters much more of an original feel to them. The dialogue in AAA games is usually good, but also does feel like it's gone through about 8 different people screening it before we get to hear it, and so it can start to have a similar feel from game to game. A AAA game will pretty much always be looking to do one thing: make as much money as possible. And the main way of doing this is by keeping your target audience as large as possible, and not honing in on anything that could be considered niche. But indie games do have that advantage of being able to do whatever the hell they want. It's why there are so many games that explore mental health themes. Often it's an expression from the developer that somebody else that struggled with a similar thing can relate to. And these potentially darker themes are much rarer in games that are looking to appeal to absolutely everybody, because a lot of people just won't really relate to, or care about, a game about depression or anxiety struggles. The flip side to this, though, is that indie games are also pretty much forced to innovate. This is because otherwise, they are competing with other games that are doing the same sort of thing, just with a lot more money, resources, and probably an established audience. Imagine if an indie dev wanted to make a third-person shooter game where you and a bunch of other players were dropped into this world, and forced to gather resources and fight while building structures with those resources. Fortnite. That's just fucking Fortnite. And when you're up against a powerhouse game like that, it's pretty difficult to get people to want to play your version of it instead. So you have to innovate and think of new and original gameplay elements that'll spark that interest. Enter the Gungeon did this pretty well by creating a bullet hell roguelike that is entirely themed around guns. Instead of finding things that make you stronger, you will find different guns that'll be useful for different situations. This really helps it stand out from other games in its genre, and gives it a really unique appeal in both the gameplay and the general look of the game. Sometimes the actual lack of funding can also help create that innovation. Many AAA studios now are going for that hyperrealism look, which can really make the game look stunning, but indies aren't really able to do that because, again, there is just a lack of money and resources to make it possible, and so we get stylization. Now, a lot of the time, this tends to be in the form of pixel art, which has become pretty synonymous with indies as a whole, to the point where people will see modern pixel art in a game and go, "Yo, look at this new indie game I found." More on that later. Most of my favourite game visuals tend to come from indies. Celeste has some stunning areas and such a satisfying art style. Katana Zero uses colours incredibly well throughout the entire game, which helps to give it that sort of dystopia vibe. And I love the 3D environments of A Short Hike, which make the world feel genuinely interesting, even if nothing is going on there. This stylization can help to keep indie games relevant far after their release. I mean, just look at Undertale. That game's art style is so iconic now because of its originality. So, why does any of this matter? Well, it doesn't. Until it does. Sorry, I just love a plot twist. This year, a game came out called Dave the Diver. It's a fantastic game where you go diving in the day to catch fish, and then work at the sushi bar in the evenings using the very same fish that you caught. Damn, they're really exploiting my man Dave over here. This game is absolutely fantastic. I love the gameplay loop, the story elements, the music, and the visuals. But it is not an indie game. It's being disguised as one, but it's not. The game's developer and publisher is a company called Mint Rocket, which is a small team that was created by Nexon, which is an extremely rich South Korean game publisher. And even while Mint Rocket themselves do not believe that Dave the Diver is an indie, for some reason it was nominated for Best Independent Game in the Game Awards, against other actual indie games. Somehow this wasn't even the biggest problem at the Game Awards, but that's a different topic. Now, if Dave the Diver were an indie, I would absolutely be wanting it to win awards in that category. But the fact that it isn't, and it's going up against actual indie games who weren't funded by billion-dollar corporations, is pretty unfair. Can you tell what recent event inspired this video? Jeff Keighley, who hosted the awards, went on to say some interesting, but wrong, things about what the term indie means within the context of Dave the Diver being nominated, essentially claiming that the term can mean different things to different people, when the studio that made it simply isn't, as they were created by another billion-dollar company, who are just using a different name. I get that the term is vague, but the bottom line is that the developers do need to have that independency, and can't be owned, financed, and potentially controlled by some other huge publisher. There are so many indie games that are made by just small handfuls of people that are just itching to be seen, and when games like Dave the Diver, as good as it may be, are given that indie spotlight instead of actual indie games, it just becomes yet another hurdle for what could be the next indie sensation. If Dave the Diver needed a little more money, they could probably ask Nexon for it, and if it didn't do great, it's hardly going to bankrupt the company. The definition of an indie game is vague, broad, and sometimes completely misunderstood. But the one defining factor is that the developers need to be independent, and not owned by some other publisher who are going to be dictating the direction of the game to them while throwing their money around. Typically, an indie game is going to be created by a small team of developers with a much more restricted budget than that of a AAA game. They tend to have much more creative freedom, and don't just enjoy innovation, they often rely on it to stand out. But importantly, indie games aren't just games with pixel graphics, or short and cheap games, which is apparently a debatable topic. So, even though the term could really use an official, broadly accepted definition, we do at least have a few general conventions, some typical rules, and the understanding that context can be pretty vital for understanding the whole development process for a game. But as a general rule, an indie game is a game that's financially and creatively independent of another big AAA company.